The Galactic Council demanded Earth's surrender. Humanity just laughed, and the first thing the Galactic Council sent was not a fleet. It was a child. Not literally, but the being that stepped off the small diplomatic shuttle onto Earth's orbital docking station looked, by every biological measure available to the human doctors who quietly scanned it, like something that had not finished growing. It was pale and thin, with oversized eyes the color of deep water and limbs that seemed slightly too long for its body. It wore a silver sash across its chest that apparently indicated enormous rank. Its name, as best as the translation systems could render it, was something like Cyril. Cyril was the youngest diplomat the Galactic Council had ever assigned to a first contact notification. This was not an accident. The Council sent junior envoys to deliver surrender demands because it did not consider the delivery worthy of senior staff. The message would speak for itself. The recipient would comply. The envoy would return. 3 cycles, 4 at most. Cyril stood in the docking bay and looked at the humans who had come to receive it and felt, for the first time in its short diplomatic career, uncertain. The humans were not afraid. Every species Cyril had been trained to expect, the 40 civilizations listed in the Council's compliance record, had shown fear at this stage. It came in different forms. Some species went still. Some made sounds. Some tried to negotiate immediately, which was also a form of fear. Fear was the expected response to the arrival of a Council notification envoy, because fear was rational and the situation warranted it. The humans were looking at Cyril with something that was not fear and was not aggression either. Several of them seemed genuinely curious. One of the dock workers, a broad woman with grease on her hands who had clearly just stopped working to see what the fuss was about, was looking at Cyril with the expression of someone watching an unusual bird land in their garden. Cyril delivered the message. Full formal council text, translated in real time through the station systems into every major human language simultaneously. The terms were clear. Earth would surrender its autonomous status, dissolve its space program, register as a Council client state, and begin resource contribution protocols within 30 cycles. The woman who stepped forward to receive the message was named Delegate Yara Solano. She was compact and dark-haired, and had the particular stillness of someone who spent a lot of time in rooms where things were about to go badly and had learned to treat that as a normal condition. She took the formal document from Cyril, read it in full without rushing, folded it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she looked at Cyril and said, "Are you hungry? You've just traveled a long way." Cyril had no prepared response for this. The Council had given Earth 30 cycles to comply. By cycle 3, 3 things had happened that were not in the Council's operational model. First, Cyril had not left. Yara had offered the young envoy hospitality for the duration of the response period, framing it as a gesture of diplomatic courtesy. Cyril, who had been trained to maintain formal distance from notification targets, had intended to refuse. It had not been able to find, in any of its training materials, the correct formal language for refusing hospitality from a species that offered it with no apparent strategic motive. So it had stayed in a small room on the orbital station, and the humans around it had continued to treat it with a casualness that Cyril found deeply disorienting. They asked it questions, not about the Council's military capacity or the terms of compliance or the consequences of refusal. They asked Cyril where it was from, what it ate, whether it had family, what the journey through deep space was like from the inside of a Council shuttle. An engineer named Deo spent 40 minutes describing the orbital station's design to Cyril in detail, not because Deo wanted anything from the information exchange, but because, as Deo explained cheerfully, she had built part of it herself and was proud of it. Cyril found itself answering. It did not entirely understand why. Second, Earth's response to the Council had been delivered, and it was not compliance, and it was not a counter-ultimatum. It was a question, a single, formal, diplomatically phrased question transmitted to the Council's command vessel by Earth's communications office. Under what authority does the Galactic Council claim jurisdiction over sovereign civilizations that have not entered into any treaty or agreement with Council governance? The Council's legal division received this question and experienced something it had not experienced in 300 years of operation. It could not immediately answer. Not because the answer did not exist, because the answer, written out plainly, was not one the Council wanted to transmit in a formal record. Third, Cyril had sent a private report to its direct supervisor on the Council vessel. The supervisor had read it twice and then brought it to Orion, because it was not the kind of report that a supervisor handled alone. It said, "These people are not preparing to surrender. They are also not preparing to fight. I do not know what they are preparing to do. I think they are prepared to wait longer than we are." Orion read the report sitting alone in his quarters, which he rarely did, because he preferred to process difficult information without his staff watching his face. He had run corrective actions for 40 years. He knew the sequence. The message arrived, the fleet appeared, the civilization counted its ships against the Council's ships and arrived at the only conclusion the math permitted. Some took longer than others. Some made noise before they complied, but they all complied because the alternative was not survivable, and every species in the galaxy understood that. Humanity appeared to understand it too. They were not disputing the military reality. They were not making claims about their own strength that did not hold up. They were doing something else, something Orion needed another day to name, and when he finally named it, he sat with the word for a long time. They were unbothered, not performing calm, not pretending to an indifference they did not feel. Genuinely, functionally unbothered in the way of something that has been in difficult situations before and made peace with the fact that difficult situations are simply what situations are. He called Cyril directly, bypassing the formal chain, which he had not done with a junior envoy in 20 years. "Tell me something," he said. "The humans, what do they talk about when they are not talking about us?" Cyril was quiet for a moment. "Everything," it said. "Their work, their families, a sporting competition that is apparently happening next week that several of them are very invested in. The engineer explained to me the specific structural reason a particular support beam in Section 7 is likely to cause problems in 18 months. And the fleet outside their system. They know it is there," Cyril said. "They check the tracking data in the mornings, then they go back to work." Orion closed the channel and sat with that for a very long time. Outside the station window, somewhere unreachably far away, Earth continued its slow rotation around a medium-sized star, unbothered, waiting, working on something Orion could not yet see. The Galactic Council demanded Earth's surrender. Humanity just laughed, and the Council's legal division took 11 days to answer Earth's question. 11 days for a body that had operated continuously for 4 centuries and had a legal archive larger than most planetary libraries. The delay was itself a kind of answer, but Earth's communications office received the formal response without comment and forwarded it to the World Assembly's analysis team, which was led by a man named Felix Addo. Felix was 61 years old, had 3 advanced degrees, and had spent most of his career in international law on Earth itself, trade disputes, territorial waters, the slow grinding work of making agreements between parties who did not fully trust each other. He had been pulled into the Council's situation because someone in the Assembly had looked at the question Earth needed to ask and realized it was fundamentally a legal question, not a military one. He read the Council's response in full. Then he read it again. Then he printed it, which he only did with documents he intended to mark up extensively, and spent 6 hours with a red pen. The Council's legal argument rested on something called the doctrine of galactic stabilization, a principle established 300 years ago by the founding council species, which held that any civilization demonstrating independent faster-than-light capability within range of established council space represented a potential destabilizing force, and that the council therefore had both the right and the obligation to bring such civilizations into the managed order. It was, in other words, a rule the council had written about itself, for itself, enforced by itself. Felix wrote 3 words in the margin next to the core clause. Then he took a photo of it and sent it to Yara. The 3 words were, "They made this up." Yara received the message at 600 and laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. Cyril had been on the orbital station for 14 days when Deo took it on a walk through the station's exterior observation ring. The ring was a transparent corridor that ran along the outside of the station's upper level, offering an unobstructed view of space in all directions. It was used primarily by off-duty staff who wanted somewhere quiet to think. Deo had brought Cyril here because Cyril had, in a moment of unguarded honesty the previous evening, admitted that its quarters felt very small. They walked slowly. Cyril's long limbs moved with a careful precision, as if it was always slightly worried about taking up too much space. Deo walked the way she did everything like the floor was hers. Below them, the curve of Earth was visible, blue and white and deeply unremarkable looking from this distance, the way all planets look unremarkable from space, all their specific chaos and color flattened into a single round object. "How long has your species been out here?" Cyril asked. It meant in space. "Seriously, about 60 years, Deo said. We had a few people make it to our moon a couple of centuries ago, but consistent orbital presence is about 60 years, and we've only been past our own system for the last 12. Cyril processed this. 12 years. The Council had civilizations in client-state status that had been space-faring for 3,000 years before they were brought into compliance. And in that 12 years, Cyril said carefully, you have refused the Council. We've asked a legal question, Deo said with a small smile. That's different. Is it? Deo thought about it genuinely, which Cyril had come to notice was something humans did. They thought about things, even quick questions, as if the answer might actually matter. Yeah, she said. A refusal is the end of a conversation. A question keeps it open. Cyril looked at Earth below them. My supervisors believe you are stalling, it said, buying time in hope that something changes. Something is always changing, Deo said. That's sort of our whole thing. On the Council command vessel, the mood had shifted in a way that Orion's staff found difficult to categorize. The fleet was still in position. The deadline had passed and no compliance had arrived, and yet the corrective action had not been authorized, because Orion had not authorized it, because he was waiting for something he could not name. His senior staff were too experienced to ask him directly. They processed their own work and watched him and said nothing. What Orion was waiting for arrived on day 17, from a source he had not expected. Counselor Deva transmitted from the Council's home station. She was the oldest member of the inner circle and rarely communicated outside of formal sessions, which meant that when she did, it was worth reading carefully. Her message to Orion was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph noted that Earth's legal question had been distributed, through channels Deva described only as informal, to 14 civilizations currently under client-state status. All 14 had received it. At least 9 of them had apparently been waiting, for years, for someone to ask it out loud. The second paragraph said, before you authorize the strike, I need you to understand what you will be striking. Not a planet that asked a question. A precedent. The first one in 400 years. Orion read the message 3 times. Then he called his senior legal advisor and asked a question he had never needed to ask before. Is the doctrine of galactic stabilization defensible in an open forum? The advisor's pause was answer enough. It was written to be enforced, the advisor said carefully, not to be debated. Those are not the same thing, Orion said. No, the advisor agreed, they are not. Yara received the council's second communication on day 19. It was not a second ultimatum. It was a request, formal, stiff, written in the particular style of an institution that found asking for things uncomfortable for a meeting, not a compliance processing session, a meeting with no predetermined outcome stated. She read it twice. Then she walked down to the observation ring, where Cyril was sitting alone watching Earth rotate, and sat beside it. They want to talk, she said. Cyril looked at her. I know, I received the same notification. Did you expect this? The young envoy was quiet for a moment. Outside, Earth turned slowly, indifferent to the politics being conducted in its orbit. No, Cyril said honestly. I was trained for 30 cycles, 4 at most. I have been here 19 days. I have eaten 14 different human foods. I have heard more questions in 19 days than I heard in my entire training. It paused. I did not expect any of this. Yara looked at it. For what it's worth, she said, neither did we. She pulled out her communicator and began drafting a response to the council's meeting request. She accepted. She named 3 conditions: neutral location, open agenda, no predetermined compliance timeline. Then she added one line at the end that was not standard diplomatic language. She wrote, "We will bring food." She sent it before she could reconsider, and felt, for a reason she did not fully examine, that it was exactly right. The Galactic Council demanded Earth's surrender. Humanity just laughed, and the neutral location turned out to be a problem. The Council wanted somewhere in open space, equidistant from Earth and the fleet, on a Council-registered platform. Earth declined platforms registered to either party and suggested instead the HFY Station, a small, independent refueling and transit point run by a species called the Maori, who had been operating it for 2 centuries with a studied neutrality that had made them the preferred middlemen of 3 different interstellar trade disputes. The Maori had no military, no political alliances, and an extremely good reputation for making hot food available at all hours. The Council's initial response to this suggestion was silence, which Yara had learned to read as reluctant agreement. The Maori, for their part, received the meeting request and sent back a confirmation within 4 hours, along with a detailed dietary questionnaire and a note from the station manager, a short, round-bodied being named Finn, that said simply, "We will prepare for 8 delegates per side and also for Cyril, who has been to us before and likes the warm grain." Cyril, reading over Yara's shoulder, made a small sound that Yara had come to understand was embarrassment. The delegation that Earth sent to the HFY Station was not what the Council expected. Yara led it. Felix came, with his printed copy of the Council's legal response and his red pen tucked in a jacket pocket. Deo came because Yara had decided, deliberately, to bring someone who was not a diplomat, someone who built things and thought in structural terms and would not be impressed by ceremony. The 4th human delegate was a man named Ryo Nakamura, who had spent 30 years as a conflict mediator in Earth's most difficult regional disputes, and whose presence communicated, to anyone who could read it, that this was not a negotiation for show. They brought food, as promised. Specifically, Deo had spent 2 days researching which Earth foods had the broadest cross-species palatability based on the xenobiological data Earth's researchers had compiled, and had packed accordingly. She carried a bag that smelled extraordinary, and that 3 Maori dock workers stared at as the delegation passed. The Council's delegation arrived an hour later. Orion came himself. This surprised everyone, including his own staff, who had expected him to send a senior representative. He came with 2 legal advisors and a being named Paul Savin, who was the Council's head of external relations, and had the particular expression of someone attending a meeting they had formally argued against. The fifth member of the council's delegation was unexpected. Counselor Deva had not told Orion she was coming. She had informed him 30 minutes before departure in a message that read, "I will be attending. This does not require your approval." Her presence was technically within her rights as an inner circle member. Orion had not responded to the message. She was very old. She moved carefully and sat down with the deliberate patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time. Cyril sat in the corner, technically as the council's original envoy, but practically as something that had stopped being fully on one side of the table and had not yet found a name for what it was instead. Fenn brought food to the table, both kinds. The meeting did not begin well. Paul Savin opened with a formal restatement of the council's position, which was functionally identical to the original surrender demand with slightly different sentence structure. Felix listened to it in full, waited for it to finish, and then set his printed copy of the council's legal document on the table, open to the page he had marked. "We would like to discuss the doctrine of galactic stabilization," he said, in the tone of a man who had spent his career making sure that the thing being discussed was actually the thing being discussed. Paul Savin said the doctrine was not subject to external review. Felix said that was an interesting position and asked who had established that. Paul Savin said the council had. Felix said yes, he had noticed that. The silence that followed was the particular silence of an argument that has just exposed its own foundation and found the foundation smaller than expected. Orion, who had been watching this exchange with an expression that revealed nothing, spoke for the first time. "Delegate Solano," he said, addressing Yara, "you are a small civilization, 12 years out of your own system, with 41 ships and no shield technology above Class 2. You are sitting across from the governing body of a quarter of the inhabited galaxy. What is it you believe you are doing here?" The question was not aggressive. It was genuinely curious, in the way of someone who has encountered a situation their existing frameworks cannot fully explain. Yara looked at him. "The same thing we always do," she said, figuring it out. It was Deva who changed the shape of the meeting. She had not spoken in the first hour. She had eaten a small amount of what Deo had brought, something called a date, which she consumed with visible interest and watched. When she finally spoke, everyone at the table paid attention, because she was the oldest person in the room by a very large margin, and she had the quality of someone who only spoke when they had finished thinking. She looked at Yara and Felix and Deo and Rio in turn. Then she said, "I want to ask you something that is not on the formal agenda. You sent a legal question. You did not send a threat, a counterfeit, or a plea. You sent a question." She paused. "Why a question?" It was Rio who answered. He had been quiet for most of the meeting, watching the dynamics, doing the thing he had trained for, reading the room. "Because a question is an opening," he said. "A threat closes things down. A question keeps them open, and we needed things to stay open." Deva looked at him for a long moment. "You were not buying time," she said slowly. "You were building space." "Yes," Rio said. Deva turned to Orion. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He had heard the exchange, and something in his expression had shifted in a way that was very small and very significant. Under the table, Cyril had its long hands folded together, watching everything, feeling something it had no council-trained word for. Outside the way station, Fenn was restocking the food table, and quietly hopping this meeting went well, because the Mari had been stuck between large powers for 2 centuries, and a galaxy with more open doors sounded, to a being of Fenn's practical disposition, considerably better than the alternative. The Galactic Council demanded Earth's surrender. Humanity just laughed, and the meeting at the HFY station lasted 3 days. This was not planned. The first day had been scheduled as a single 4-hour session, But something happened partway through the afternoon of day one that neither side had prepared for, and by evening no one had left, and Fenn had quietly doubled the food order and made up 4 additional sleeping rooms. What happened was that Deva asked Rio a second question. She had been thinking since his answer about building space, sitting with it the way she sat with everything slowly, completely, and when the formal session paused for a break she found him standing by the viewport looking at the stars, and she stood beside him and said, "Tell me how you do it, your species. You have been to the edge of destruction multiple times. Your own histories confirm this, and each time something in you continues. What is that?" Rio was quiet for a moment. He was used to hard questions. He asked them professionally. "I don't think there's one thing," he said. "I think it's more like we're very bad at accepting that something is over. It's almost a flaw. We don't give up on things we probably should give up on. Relationships, projects, civilizations. We keep working on them past the point that makes sense." Deva looked at him. "You consider that a flaw?" she said. "Sometimes it is," he said, "and sometimes it's the only reason we're still here." Deva was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I have been in council governance for 140 years. I have watched 40 civilizations accept client state status. Some of them were thriving before we arrived. Some of them are barely functioning now." She stopped. "I have told myself for 140 years that the stability the council provides outweighs the cost of how we provide it. I am no longer certain that is true." Rio looked at her. He did not say anything immediately, because some things deserve to be received before they are responded to. "That sounds like a hard thing to sit with," he said finally. "Yes," Deva said, "it is." That was when the meeting stopped being about compliance. By the morning of day 2, the formal agenda had been quietly set aside. Not abandoned. Set aside, the way you set down a heavy thing you have been carrying when you find somewhere to rest, with the intention of picking it up again, but not yet. What was happening instead was harder to categorize. Orion had spent an hour with Felix going through the legal structure of the doctrine of galactic stabilization. Not in combat, not with Felix attacking it and Orion defending, but in the particular mode of 2 people with legal training looking at a document together and being honest about what it said. Orion had written parts of this doctrine himself, 20 years ago, and he had not looked at it recently, and looking at it now through the questions Felix kept asking, careful, specific questions, never rhetorical, he found things he did not entirely like. Deo had been pulled by Paul Savin into an entirely separate conversation about engineering. Paul Savin's species built things. Deo built things. Somewhere around the second hour of day 2, they were looking at a structural diagram of the Keth way station on Deo's tablet and arguing cheerfully about load distribution. And Fenn had brought them both extra food without being asked, because Fenn had been running a way station long enough to recognize that 2 beings who were arguing about something they both loved were not going to cause any trouble. Cyril spent most of day 2 with Yara, who had noticed something on day 1 and had not been sure whether to say anything about it. On the morning of day 2, she decided to say it. "You've changed," she said. They were walking the corridor outside the meeting rooms. "Since you arrived on the station 3 weeks ago." Cyril considered denying it. Then it considered whether denial was actually something it wanted to practice. "I was trained," it said slowly, "to deliver a message and observe the response. The response categories I was given are compliance, delay, negotiation request, hostile action. Those are the 4 things that happen. I have been waiting for 3 weeks to identify which category your species falls into." "And," Yara said. "You are none of them," Cyril said. "You are doing something that does not have a category. You are treating this as a problem to be worked on, like it is a thing that can be improved." It paused. "The Council does not think of these situations as things that can be improved. They are things to be resolved. Resolved means finished. You are not trying to finish this." Yara smiled slightly. "No," she said, We're trying to make it better." Sarah walked beside her and did not say anything for a while, and Yara did not push, because she had learned by now that Sarah needed time to process things, and that time was not nothing. On the evening of day 2, Orion did something he had not done in 30 years. He asked for a private conversation with no agenda. He asked Yara. She agreed immediately. They sat in one of the smaller rooms, 2 chairs, a table, one of Deo's packed foods that Orion had eaten earlier and apparently decided warranted a second appearance, and Orion said without preamble, "We are not going to achieve compliance from you." It was not a question. "No," Yara said. "And you know that we could force it," he said, "militarily." "You could damage us," Yara said. "I don't know if that's the same thing." Orion looked at her. "That is a meaningful distinction to you." "It's a meaningful distinction to everyone. You've just never had a species make you look at it closely before." He was quiet. Outside the room, the way station hummed its quiet mechanical hum, doing what it had done for 200 years, holding space between things, giving beings somewhere to stop. "What do you want?" he said finally. "Actually, if you could write the outcome of this, what would it say?" Yara had thought about this for weeks. She had an answer ready, but she took a moment anyway, because she wanted it to land correctly. "A seat," she said. "Not because we earned it by your measures, because we exist. A seat, a voice, and the same legal question asked on behalf of every civilization you've brought in without asking them first." Orion sat with that. "That question," he said, "would be very disruptive." "Yes," Yara said, "it would." The room was quiet again. From the corridor, they could hear Deo and Paulsavin still arguing about structural load bearing, and somewhere further away Fenn was clattering something in the kitchen, and the sound of all of it, the ordinary, functional, continuing sound of beings going about their business, sat in the room between them like a third presence. Orion picked up the small food item from the table, looked at it for a moment, and ate it. "Tell me," he said, "what form this seat would take." He had been using it for 3 weeks, marking up council documents, flagging clauses, building the legal architecture of Earth's challenge to the stabilization doctrine. He was good at this work. It was what he had been brought for. But somewhere on the afternoon of day 3, he looked at the pen in his hand and realized that the conversation in the room had moved past it. He put it in his pocket. He picked up a clean sheet. He started writing something new. The conversation between Yara and Orion had not stayed private for long. Not because anyone shared it deliberately, but because on a small way station with thin walls and beings who were paying close attention, things diffused. By morning of day 3, something had shifted in the room that everyone could feel and nobody needed to name out loud. Orion had asked what form a seat would take. Yara had described it over the rest of that evening, not as a demand, not as a legal position, but as a possibility. A structure that did not replace the council but added something to it. A review body, independent with the authority to examine compliance actions and ask the question that Earth had asked. Under what authority? Not to reverse history, not to tear down what existed, just to establish going forward that the question could be asked without being crushed. And then the other thing. The harder thing. A process for client-state civilizations to petition for reassessment. Not automatic freedom, not a reversal of existing arrangements, just a door, just the acknowledgement that doors could exist. Orion had listened to all of it without interrupting. At the end he had said nothing for a long time. Then he had said, "I need to speak with Deva." Deva and Orion walked the exterior observation ring of the Kethway station together for an hour. They had known each other for 40 years. They disagreed frequently and had, over those 40 years, developed the particular respect that comes from disagreeing with someone who is not stupid and not careless. She pushed him. He pushed back. The council was better for it mostly, even when neither of them would say so. She had been waiting for this conversation. The review body is manageable, he said. It was how he opened difficult things with the part he had already made peace with. The reassessment process is the problem. I know, Deva said. If we open that door, 40 civilizations will walk through it. Some of them will leave client-state status entirely. The logistics alone. Orion, Deva said quietly, and he stopped. She looked out at the stars for a moment before she spoke again. We have been telling ourselves for 400 years that stability requires control, and it does some control, some structure. But there is a kind of control that holds things still by holding them down, and I have been watching the things we have held down for 140 years, and I am telling you now that they are not stable. They are held. She paused. There is a difference. He was quiet. Some of those 40 civilizations, she said, have technologies we have restricted. Some of them have cultural knowledge we have never asked about. Some of them have been contributing resources to council operations for decades with nothing in return except the continued absence of a second fleet. She looked at him. What have we actually built with all of that? Order, he said, but the word came out slightly less certain than he intended. We built order for ourselves, Deva said. I am asking what we built for them. The stars outside the viewport did not answer. They never did. That was the thing about stars. They were very good at being present and very unhelpful with the actual questions. Orion turned back toward the meeting rooms. I will need 30 cycles to prepare the inner circle, he said. Deva said 20. He almost smiled. Felix's clean sheet had become 4 pages by the time the formal session resumed. He presented it to both delegations simultaneously, not as Earth's proposal, but as a draft, explicitly labeled as a working document, with space in the margins for both parties to mark. He had designed it this way deliberately. A proposal could be accepted or rejected. A draft invited people to pick up a pen. Paul Savin picked up a pen within 2 minutes, which surprised everyone including Paul Savin. The document outlined a structure called the Civilizational Review Charter. 3 elements, the independent review body Yara had described, staffed by beings from non-council and non-client state species, so neither party owned it. A petition process for client state reassessment, beginning with the 5 civilizations that had been under compliance protocols longest. And a new class of council membership, not full founding membership, not client state, but something in between, with a voice in council proceedings on matters that directly affected the species in question. Earth would be the first to hold this new class of membership, not because it was the most powerful or the most advanced, but because it was the one that had asked the question that made the room exist. Deva read the document slowly, all the way through, making no marks. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Yara. You wrote this, she said, knowing that you are a civilization of 60 years in space, negotiating against a body 4 centuries old, with 41 ships against a fleet that could end your infrastructure in an afternoon. Yes, Yara said. And you wrote it this way. Deva tapped the document, with space for our marks, not as a victory, as a beginning. That's all we ever do, Yara said, begin things. In the corner, Cyril had stopped taking notes. It was just watching. Its long hands were still in its lap, and its deep-water eyes were moving between the faces at the table, Deva's old, careful face, Orion's unreadable one, Felix's focused one, Yara's steady one, and something was assembling itself inside Cyril that its training had no word for. It felt, for the first time in its diplomatic career, like it was watching something being built rather than something being settled. From the kitchen, the smell of Fenn's cooking drifted through the corridor. Outside, the stars held their usual silence. The pen moved across the page. Someone poured water. Someone asked a question. Someone answered it. The work continued. 40 cycles of inner circle sessions, of legal drafting and redrafting, of Paul Savin arguing about implementation timelines and Felix arguing back, with the specific patience of someone who had decided to win by never getting tired. 40 cycles of Deva working the internal politics of the council, with the unhurried precision of someone who had been doing it for a century, and knew exactly which conversations happened before the vote and which ones happened after. Earth went about its business. This was not a strategy, exactly, or not only a strategy. It was simply what 11 billion people did when faced with a long waiting period. They worked, they argued. They built things, they fed each other. They had a sporting competition that a significant portion of the planet cared about deeply, and that the Council's analysts noted in a report with the observation that the humans did not appear to consider their own survival situation more important than their recreational leagues, which was categorized as further evidence of anomalous psychological profile. Admiral Ren Volkov's 41 ships stayed in position, not aggressively, just present the way a person stands in a doorway, not blocking it, not going through it, simply there. Cyril went home for the first time since being dispatched to Earth, filed its report, and then did something that no notification envoy had ever done before. It requested reassignment back to Earth orbit. Its supervisor asked why. Cyril thought about how to explain it and eventually said, "I think I am still learning something." The request was granted, partly because no one knew which regulation covered it, and partly because Counselor Deva had quietly indicated that Cyril's presence in the Earth situation had been useful and should continue. Deo sent Cyril a message when she heard. It said, "Good. I need someone to explain to the Council why Section 7 is going to be a problem in 18 months, and you are the only one who was paying attention." The ratification session was held at the Kethway station, because Yara had requested it and Orion had agreed without much argument, which Deva noted privately as a sign of how much had changed. Fen had outdone itself for the occasion. The food was extraordinary. 3 Mari dock workers had been rotated to cooking duty, and the smell that came from the kitchen was the kind of smell that makes beings of many different species stop what they are doing and locate the source. The signing table had space for 6 marks, Orion for the Council, Deva as inner circle witness, Yara for Earth, Felix as legal certifier, and 2 marks from the first client-state civilizations to enter the petition process, beings who had traveled a long way to put their names on a document that said, formally and permanently, that the question could be asked. One of them was an elderly being named Tor, from a civilization that had been under client-state status for 180 years. Tor was not a diplomat. Tor was a historian, which was why Tor's government had sent it, because what was happening today was something that needed someone present who would understand, in full, what it meant. Tor stood at the table and looked at the document for a long moment before signing. Yara was standing close enough to speak quietly. "How does it feel?" she asked. Tor looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read because Tor's species expressed things in ways humans had not yet fully learned. But some things carry across biology. "Like a window opening," Tor said, "after a very long time in a room with no air." Yara put her hand briefly on Tor's arm. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The marks were made. The charter existed. 6 months after ratification, 3 things had happened that the Council's projections had not anticipated. The first was that 2 client-state civilizations had completed the petition process and moved to the new intermediate membership class. Both of them, in their first formal Council proceedings as intermediate members, had contributed something. One, a navigational technique that improved deep space routing by a measurable percentage. One, a medical synthesis process that had been sitting in restricted status for 60 years because no one had thought to ask. The Council's resource models had not accounted for what happened when the beings contributing resources also had a voice in how they were used. The second was that Cyril had been promoted. This was not routine. Cyril was young and the council promoted slowly. But Deva had written the recommendation herself, and it was specific. Cyril had demonstrated the capacity to be genuinely changed by an assignment rather than simply completing it. That, she wrote, was rarer than expertise and more valuable. Cyril received the news while sitting in the orbital station with Deo, who was explaining for the third time why Section 7 was going to be a problem. Cyril read the notification, set it down, and went back to the diagram. Deo asked what the message was. Cyril said it was a promotion. Deo said that was great and went back to the diagram too. Cyril thought, not for the first time, that this was a very human way to handle good news, and that it was also, possibly, the right way. The third thing was smaller, and did not appear in any official record. In the meeting room at the HFY station where the charter had been signed, Fenn had left the table set. Not permanently, the room was used for other meetings, but on the day of signing, after everyone else had gone, Fenn had stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the table. 200 years of running a way station. 200 years of being stopping in transit, staying briefly, moving on. Fenn had seen disputes resolved and disputes ignited, had watched large powers send fleets and small ones send petitions, and most of them, most of the time, leave things approximately as they had found them. This felt different. Fenn could not have said precisely why. Fenn was not a diplomat or a historian or a legal expert. Fenn ran a station and made food and kept the lights on. But something about the marks on that document, the different shapes of them from different hands, felt less like an ending and more like a sentence that had finally been given its first word. Fenn turned off the room light and went back to the kitchen. There were more travelers coming in the morning. There were always more travelers, and they would be hungry and the food would be ready, and whatever they were carrying, disputes or questions or fears or beginnings, they would find, here at this small and neutral place between things, that someone had thought ahead and set a place for them. Somewhere out past the stars, Earth turned. The fleet that had arrived to force its surrender was gone. The question it had asked was not. It was in the language of the charter now, permanent and formal and available to anyone who needed it. Under what authority? 3 words. Asked by a civilization 60 years out of its own system, with 41 ships and a bag of food and the particular human inability to accept that something could not be made better. The galaxy, for the first time in 400 years, did not have a clean answer. It was, improbably and stubbornly, a start.